Did you know that while the United States is investing billions of dollars in electric vehicle factories, America depends on other countries for 76% of the metal that makes those batteries actually work? We're talking about cobalt, a blue-gray mineral that might seem insignificant, but literally determines whether America's energy future will be independent or controlled by others. Data from the U.S. Geological Survey shows that only 24% of the cobalt used in the country comes from domestic sources, while the other 76% must be imported from a complex and often problematic global supply chain. To understand what this means for America's future, we need to first understand what makes this metal so special and why it has become the center of a silent geopolitical struggle. Cobalt is essential for the lithium-ion batteries that power everything from our smartphones to Tesla cars. In NMC batteries, which are the automotive industry standard, cobalt represents between 10 to 20% of the cathode composition. Without it, these batteries lose stability, durability, and fast charging capability. It's literally the ingredient that separates a functional battery from dead weight. But here's the strategic problem that few Americans know about. 70% of all the world's cobalt comes from a single country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, a nation marked by political instability, armed conflicts, and working conditions that violate basic human rights. This creates a vulnerability that goes far beyond simple supply chain disruption. When a single unstable country controls nearly three-quarters of a critical material, every factory, every electric vehicle, and every clean energy project in America becomes hostage to events thousands of miles away. The situation becomes even more concerning when we examine who actually controls the supply chain. While the Congo produces the raw material, China refines 73% of the world's cobalt, while the United States refines 0% of virgin cobalt. This means that even if cobalt is mined in Africa, it must travel to China to be processed before it can be used in American batteries. Chinese companies now control nearly half of global cobalt production and are projected to control 46% of global cobalt supply by 2030. This isn't happening by accident.
China has systematically invested in cobalt mining operations across Africa, acquiring stakes in 15 of the 19 major cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Through strategic partnerships with the Congolese government and direct ownership of mining operations, China has effectively cornered the market on this critical material. The result is a supply chain where American companies must ultimately depend on Chinese-controlled processes to obtain the materials they need for clean energy technology. The human cost of this dependency is staggering. In the cobalt mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo, an estimated 11,000 men and women work in dangerous conditions, many without protective equipment, tunneling as deep as 100 meters into the earth for poverty wages. Workers report exposure to toxic dust, collapsing tunnels, and working conditions that one miner described by saying, "We miners die a lot." Children as young as 7 work in these mines, carrying heavy loads and breathing toxic cobalt dust that causes birth defects and respiratory illness. These conditions aren't just a humanitarian crisis, they're a strategic vulnerability for America. Every electric vehicle battery, every smartphone, every piece of clean energy infrastructure depends on materials extracted under these conditions. The moral implications are clear, but the strategic implications are even more profound. America's clean energy transition is literally built on a foundation of exploited labor and Chinese control. The dependency becomes even more critical when we consider the scale of America's clean energy ambitions. Cobalt demand has grown from 140,000 tons in 2020 to over 200,000 tons in 2024, and projections show it could reach 400,000 tons by 2030. This explosive growth is driven primarily by electric vehicle adoption, which accounts for 40% of global cobalt demand. As America pushes toward President Biden's goal of 50% electric vehicle sales by 2030, the demand for cobalt will only intensify. Yet America's response to the strategic vulnerability has been inadequate. The National Defense Stockpile, which once held 13,000 tons of cobalt during the Cold War, has been depleted to just 333 tons. At the same time, domestic cobalt refining capacity remains at zero, meaning America cannot process even the small amount of cobalt it does produce domestically.
This represents a fundamental strategic failure. America has sold off its reserves while simultaneously becoming more dependent on foreign sources for processing. The implications extend far beyond economics. Cobalt is essential for military applications, including missile guidance systems, aircraft engines, and advanced electronics used in defense systems. The Department of Defense has identified cobalt as critical for national security, yet America remains 100% dependent on foreign imports for this material. In a crisis or conflict, China could potentially cut off cobalt supplies to American manufacturers, crippling both civilian and military production. This vulnerability is already showing real-world consequences. In 2024, Tesla and other American companies experienced supply chain disruptions when cobalt prices fluctuated due to political instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo. These disruptions affected production schedules and forced companies to seek alternative suppliers, often at higher costs. As global demand increases and supply remains concentrated in unstable regions, these disruptions will become more frequent and severe. The economic impact on American workers is equally concerning. While the electric vehicle industry promises to create hundreds of thousands of jobs, the reality is that the highest value activities, mining, refining, and processing critical materials, are happening overseas. American workers get assembly jobs, while Chinese workers get the more skilled and higher-paying jobs in materials processing. This represents a fundamental shift in the value chain that disadvantages American workers and reduces America's technological competitiveness. Some progress is being made toward alternatives. Researchers at MIT have developed cobalt-free battery technologies using organic materials that could potentially replace cobalt in electric vehicle batteries. These alternatives show promise, offering similar performance to cobalt-based batteries while eliminating the ethical and strategic vulnerabilities associated with cobalt mining. However, these technologies are still in development and will take years to scale to commercial production levels. Battery recycling represents another potential solution. The ReCell Center, a Department of Energy initiative, is working to develop advanced recycling technologies that could recover cobalt from used batteries and reduce dependence on newly mined materials. Currently, less than 5% of lithium-ion batteries are recycled in the United States, representing a massive waste of valuable materials. Improved recycling could potentially supply significant amounts of cobalt, but building this infrastructure will require substantial investment and time. The strategic implications of America's cobalt dependency reflect a broader pattern of critical mineral vulnerabilities. Just as America became dependent on foreign oil in the 20th century, it is now becoming dependent on foreign critical minerals in the 21st century. The difference is that these materials are even more concentrated in fewer countries, with less political stability and under greater control by strategic competitors. China's dominance in cobalt processing is part of a broader strategy to control critical mineral supply chains. By controlling the processing and refining of materials like cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements, China can influence global supply chains and potentially weaponize these dependencies in future conflicts. This represents a new form of strategic competition, where control over materials processing becomes as important as control over energy resources. The path forward requires urgent action across multiple fronts. America needs to rebuild its national defense stockpile, invest in domestic cobalt refining capacity, and develop alternative technologies that reduce dependence on cobalt altogether. The Inflation Reduction Act provides some incentives for domestic battery production, but these measures are insufficient to address the fundamental vulnerability created by Chinese control of global cobalt supply chains. More importantly, America needs to recognize that true energy independence requires more than just producing batteries domestically. It requires control over the entire supply chain, from raw materials to finished products. This means either developing domestic sources of critical minerals or building strategic partnerships with reliable allies who can provide these materials without the vulnerabilities associated with current supply chains. The cobalt crisis reveals a fundamental truth about America's clean energy transition. It cannot be achieved through market forces alone. Strategic materials like cobalt require government intervention, long-term planning, and a willingness to invest in domestic capabilities even when they cost more than foreign alternatives. The stakes are too high and the vulnerabilities too severe to leave these decisions to market forces alone.
As America moves toward an electric future, the question isn't whether electric vehicles and clean energy are good for the country. They clearly are. The question is whether America will control its own energy destiny or remain dependent on others for the materials that make that future possible. The answer to that question may determine not just America's economic competitiveness, but its national security and strategic autonomy in the decades to come. The blue metal that powers America's green future currently flows through supply chains controlled by others. Whether America can build its own path to energy independence or whether it will simply trade dependence on foreign oil for dependence on foreign critical minerals remains to be seen. What is certain is that the decisions made in the next few years will determine America's position in the global economy for generations to come.